Okay, so this is the start of chapter 12, nervous system. We've done the excretory system, now we're on the nervous system. And for those, this is kind of for those who, I know there were a number who missed the first couple of classes, and so I thought I would start doing some more video lessons. To have in the future too, but for those who were absent so they can catch up. So, to start off with, groups had to do a performance task where they actually made a model of the neuron. Okay, the neuron is the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system. There's different types, but this is generally what a neuron would look like. And they're specialized cells that send and receive electrochemical signals. So the message that travels through our nervous system is electrochemicals. That implies there's an electric part and a chemical part. And we'll get into more detail about how the message actually passes along the neuron later on in our classes. So, students were asked to read a section in the book that describes the parts of the neurons and how the basics, basically, of how the message would travel along it. So what the different parts are, what the regions are, and what direction the message would actually pass. Oh, this describes it here. And then they had to explain it to me so I could make sure that they understood it really well. Okay, so if we were to look at the neuron, these tree-like parts are called dendrites. They receive the message. They receive input or signal from other neurons. Okay, so they receive a stimulus, and the message will start traveling along them towards the cell body. This is the cell body here. And the cell body is kind of like the controlling area of the neuron because it has in it the nucleus. There's the nucleus. So it has the nucleus and a lot of the other organelles that help to make the cell run. Okay, make it be able to function. Remember, within the nucleus are the chromosomes, which direct all the activities of the cell. Okay, so from the cell body, the message would travel along this thin part that's kind of hidden under these sausage-looking things, and that's called the axon. So the axon can be anywhere from 1 millimeter to 1 meter long in us. Okay, so there's the axon, and it runs to the end of the axon. Remember, the word terminate means end, so the axon terminal is the ending of the axon. Okay, now some books refer to this whole end here as the axon terminal, whereas others refer to each of these little endings as an axon terminal. So it depends which source you're looking at. Now, not all axons will have it, but many of them do. These things that look kind of like sausages here, okay, with little spaces between them, that is a special covering, a special coating made of a fatty substance called myelin. So there are cells called Schwann cells that produce the myelin in a way that's like a jelly roll, okay, and it serves as an insulator, kind of like the plastic or specialized material on the outside of a wire for the electricity to flow in your house or wherever. Okay, those are the insulators. They kind of keep the electrical impulses from going where they're not supposed to, but they also help to speed it up in us. Okay, So they allow for the message to jump. So it actually jumps from space to space, from node to node. So the nodes are called the node of Ranvier. So each one is a node of Ranvier. That's just the name of the person who discovered them. As they were figuring out the parts, they were also supposed to look at what the parts did. And we've already kind of mentioned this for the most part, but the cell body is the largest part. It contains the nucleus and other organelles, and it regulates the functions of the neuron. The dendrites receive the impulses and carry them towards the cell body. Okay, they look like trees because that's what dendrite means. That's the meaning of the word. Axons are long and narrow, and they may or may not be myelinated. This one is, and they carry the message from the cell body to the axon terminal. In the axon terminal, in each of these little endings, it stores chemicals, special chemicals that can be released and travel to the next neuron, and they will cause it to get excited or inhibited. Okay, so they either cause another message to be sent, or they may kind of slow the messages down. We mentioned the myelin sheath. So this is just showing the myelin sheath being produced. Schwann cells, like I mentioned earlier, Schwann cells are what makes the myelin in the PNS. The PNS is all the nerves that basically carry messages to and from the brain and spinal cord. And the CNS is the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so the Schwann cells are what produce it in the PNS, and oligodendrites are what we find in the brain and spinal cord that make it. Okay, so the myelin itself, we said, was fatty substance, and because it's fatty substance, that's what makes it appear white. Okay, it allows for what we call saltatory conduction. Okay, so that's where the message can jump between the nodes, and it speeds up how fast it can pass. There we go. Okay, so this is showing the message being transmitted along an unmyelinated axon, whereas this shows myelinated. So you can see that it passes a lot faster to get to the same area. Okay, so we call it saltatory conduction, and that's basically where the message can jump from node to node, and it speeds up the transmission. If we didn't have myelinated axons, then our messages would travel too slow for us to be effective. Okay, so the myelin is produced, the myelin sheath is produced in like a jelly roll fashion. Okay, more is added on, and more is added on, and it usually is complete by the time we reach adolescence. And the spaces, or the gaps between these Schwann cells and myelin, are the nodes of Ranvier. Okay, so the presence of the myelin sheath can speed it up to as fast as 120 meters per second. So that's pretty fast. If it's unmyelinated, the maximum speed is only 1 meter per second. So it makes a huge difference in getting the messages through the nervous system. Okay, the next video actually covers these questions that were assigned later for homework, but I think I'll show you a little, let's see. There are lots of little videos that are good. These three, you could watch the saltatory conduction. They're good to explain what happens. There's also one for the
What you will
parts of
see
the
and hear in
neuron.
this presentation is the development of myelin in the peripheral nervous system and the propagation of the action potential along a myelinated axon. This multimedia presentation will be most helpful if you already have a good understanding of the Schwann cell and the electrochemical process of the neuron, called the action potential. The Schwann cell forms a protective covering around the axon. Schwann cells start to develop in the embryo and continue to increase the wrapping around the axon through childhood. This development increases the thickness of the wrappings, which peaks in adolescence. This is why teenagers have such quick responses. The Schwann cell contains the typical cell organelles and cell membrane structure. However, notice as the Schwann cell surrounds the axon that the nucleus and other organelles are squeezed to the outside wrapping of the cell. This outer wrapping of the Schwann cell is called the neurolemma. The inner lining is made up of layers upon layers of cell membrane. This inner wrapping is called the myelin sheath. You will recall that the cell membrane, called the fluid mosaic model, is made up of a bilayer of lipids integrated with proteins. The thicker the myelin, in other words, the more layers of cell membrane making up the myelin, the more advantageous it is to the axon. One advantage is the regeneration of severed axons. Another advantage is an increase in the speed of the propagation of the action potential along the axon. The rest of this presentation will concentrate on the increased speed of action potentials down the length of the myelinated axon. Here is the neuron, and you can see the repeated Schwann cell membrane forming the myelin. Note that there is a small space between the Schwann cells where the axon is not covered by the neuroglial cell. These spaces are called nodes of Ranvier. From what you already know, action potentials occur at the axon hillock and continue to be repeated away from the cell body, much like dominoes falling one after another. An action potential starts on a polarized membrane, which is...
So I think I will pause the video there. You can watch the rest of it. Once you understand a little bit more about how the message is transmitted, then this part will actually make a lot more sense and help you to visualize the action potentials and how they work and how the message, I believe it even shows what happens at the synapse, so the chemical part of the message too. Okay, a few little facts and then the different types of neurons. So we will cover those here. The first question was, how long are neurons capable of surviving? So if you read through on page 395, I believe you'd find that they're capable of surviving up to 100 years, but it doesn't mean that they all do. When do they stop undergoing cell division? In adolescence. And then you're supposed to list the three classes of neurons and state their function. So this covers the three classes of neurons. There are sensory neurons. So the sensory neurons relay information or messages about the environment from your sensory receptors, so say from receptors in your eyes or your ears or wherever, to the spinal cord and brain, to the CNS for processing. Okay, the motor neurons, if you think the word motor tends to mean, movement, okay, brings about movement. Doesn't always, it depends what it's carrying the message to, but these neurons relay information from the brain and spinal cord, from the CNS, to what we call effectors, so that they can respond to the situation. Now, effectors are usually muscles or glands. Interneurons, inter means between, so the interneurons are neurons that carry information from one neuron to another within the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so they are within the CNS itself. So this is just a little diagram showing receptors in your skin, and that they would send a message along the sensory neuron to an interneuron in your CNS, and the message would go from the interneuron to a motor neuron. So here's the cell body of the motor neuron, and would travel to, say, a muscle or a gland. In this case, there's a muscle, and it causes it to carry out a response. So those are the three types and their functions. Now, this is where the next video takes over. So I will pause here.